So I have the pleasure to introduce Corinna Kühnapfel. Corinna Kühnapfel is a PhD candidate in the artist project at the University of Vienna. She has a background in cognitive science and embodied cognition, with a focus on empirical aesthetics and neurostatics. In her PhD, she investigates the role of the body in the experience of art by considering physical engagement, movement patterns, and interoception. She's particularly interested in the special modes of bodily engagement offered by installation art and how these create conditions for engaged, insightful, and self-reflective experiences. Today, Corinna focuses for us here on the role that empirical aesthetics can play in deepening our understanding of the role proprioception may play in art reception. The stage is yours, Corinna. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction and also the invitation to speak at this workshop. As was said, I come from psychology, more specifically empirical aesthetics, so not philosophy, and I hope that I can contribute to the topic of this workshop from this perspective. And my talk will not be so much about the definition of art, but the experience of art. And just a few words on the project that my PhD is part of, namely the ARTIST project. ARTIST is short for Art and Research on Transformations of Individuals in Societies. It's an EU project which has the main research question whether art engagement can sometimes lead to intense and transformative experiences, and if yes, by which mechanisms. It has also the aim to systematically assess the modes of engaging, including the body and impacts from art. And this project originated with the question on basically why are people drawn to art? Why do a lot of people go to art museums? Why are there so many museums? So there must be something to it. So in short, why do we care about art? And maybe because it offers us very special and emotional experiences and engagements. So here are some artworks that have been described to cause very intense and even transformative experiences. For example, many people who took part in Marina Abramovich's performance called "The Artist is Present" at the MoMA started to cry, or these very claustrophobic bodily experiences in Bruce Naumann's Corridor. Or also sometimes art is used to promote change, such as with this installation by Olafur Eliasson, consisting of melting ice blocks in a circle in front of the Tate that was supposed to raise awareness on climate change. As was mentioned, my PhD topic is the role of the body in art experience. And before I will look at the body, I will look at the brain and introduce you to the field of neurostatics, where I'm coming from, and thereby I'll also tell you about two forms of embodiment. And with this, I want to show you that the role of the body in art experience has been overlooked in empirical aesthetics research. And then I will tell you about my empirical studies. I chose a study on movement, and then installation art, which has not been studied yet with regards to the body. And I will tell you why this art form is so interesting with regards to the body. And then I'll come to the empirical study that is currently ongoing with Thomas Saraceno's installation artwork in Orbit. Some of you experienced it on Wednesday. So as I said, before I look at the body, I want to look at the brain. So neurostatics is a relatively new branch of neuroscience, which explores the neural processes underlying aesthetic experience and judgment. So put simpler, how does the brain respond to art? And just to give you an idea of one of the first studies that was conducted in this field in 2004, this was an Fmri Studies, and subjects were in the scanner and viewed paintings, portrait, landscapes, still life, or abstract paintings, and they had to classify them as beautiful, neutral, or ugly. And what was found that beautiful paintings showed increased activity in the medial orbital frontal cortex. That is an area involved in emotion and reward processing. It's here in the frontal lobe of the brain. yeah, so this should give you an idea how experiments in neurostatics are conducted. And ever since this field came alive, and besides regions related to emotion and reward processing, like the medial prefrontal cortex here again in red that I mentioned, with the research up to date, we know that also areas connected to the sensory motor areas here in yellow are involved in aesthetic experience. So for example, areas that are involved in the basic processing of visual attributes, so color, form, contrast, but also the fusiform gyrus, which is associated when we see faces in, for example, representational art, or the para-hippocampal gyrus, which is associated with the recognition of environment or places depicted in art. And then we have knowledge meaning centers in blue. These involve top-down influencing factors, so previous knowledge about the art or expertise, and these are involved when forming judgment about the art and giving meaning to the experience. And so in summary, from neurostatic studies, we know that aesthetic experiences engages a distributed set of structures in the brain and likely emerges from the interaction of these core neural systems, so meaning, knowledge, sensory motor, and emotion evaluation. And this has also been called the aesthetic triad of processing components. And one network that I would like to draw attention on is the motor system, which brings us a bit closer to the topic of the workshop, which is proprioception. Very simple image of where the motor cortex lies in the brain. And you might have heard about mirror neurons before. Now, in the following, I will refer to a lot of what Liana Zatschka has just presented in her talk. But I will go over it again in case someone did not see the previous talk, and also because this research is interesting and relevant for the workshop topic. And in a few slides, I will show you why I included it in my talk and where I want to get at with this. Yeah, mirror neurons were first observed in macaque monkeys and are responsible for the action of one's own body and also when observing the actions of another person. So the mirror neurons in this monkey's brain fire when the monkey picks up the banana, and they also fire when the monkey sees someone else pick up the banana. So the action on the right side is not produced but simulated. And mirror neurons, or the mirror neurons mechanism, is also responsible for being able to empathize with other people. So for example, if you accidentally see someone cut themselves, we can simulate what this must have felt based on our own experience. Now back to art. Super interestingly, motor areas are also active when viewing static images of actions, so in the absence of actual movement. And the theory here is that our brain simulates the movements depicted in these paintings by means of the mirror neurons. So, for example, these hand or arm gestures, and this is called embodied simulation. And such activity in the motor cortex was also found for viewing images or photographs of sculpture. And the authors concluded that it's likely that this activation here in the motor cortex comes from the sense of action that the sculpture evokes in the observer. And interestingly, the motor system is not only active when we see actions depicted in the content of the painting, but also abstract art. So when there's no content, so by means of the embodied simulation mechanism, we simulate the brush strokes, so the artist's goal-directed movements, as if we would make the same gestures. And this was assessed by comparing brain activity of participants when viewing paintings on the left, so the original paintings, compared to these graphically modified paintings on the right, where you cannot infer the brush strokes anymore. Yeah, and because the study found more brain activity in the motor system for the original artworks, these results support the role of embodied simulation of the artist's gestures in the perception of artworks. Also, another study looked at these cuts in canvas by Lucio Fontana, and they also found more activity over the motor areas for the original artworks. Here in blue. And there's also research on dance that we've already seen in the last days, on dance and embodied simulation, which found that we internally simulate the body movements of dancers as if we perform a movement ourselves. And on top of that, there's also the finding that there's stronger activity in motor areas. So here, when participants liked the dance, here the smiling face compared to when they liked it less. There's also an effect of expertise in dance, so more activity in this action observation network when being familiar with the dance or having training in dance. That was mentioned by Barbara Montero yesterday, but I will not go into expertise in this presentation, just to make you aware that this research exists. So to summarize, embodied simulation is the simulation of the actions depicted in art or the gestures captured in art by means of the mirror neuron system. So the mirror neuron system was described as a mechanism to resonate with the content and also the compositional aspects of the artwork. And I showed this for representational art and abstract art and dance. Also, there's a wide discussion on whether this contributes to the formation of aesthetic experience or art evaluation. But for this presentation, I will only focus on what that this is part of looking at art, so that it's part of art perception. Okay, so anyways, so this form of embodiment only happens in the brain, and this is important. Mouse. And from the representation of the body and the movement and actions in the brain, I would like to get to the actual movements we make when we experience art. And these two aspects of embodiment have also been described as weak embodiment, so embodiment that focuses on motor processing and embodied simulation in the brain, but also, on the other hand, strong embodiment, which refers to the actual body movements themselves. And on the first day of this workshop, Markus Schrenk raised the notion of indirect and direct proprioception, and that the mirror neurons, or also, for example, eye movements, could be classified as indirect embodiment, indirect proprioception. So maybe there are similarities of what you meant with weak embodiment and indirect proprioception, and then strong embodiment and more direct proprioception. And when we look at these pictures, at the bottom, you can already see a gap to where studies in empirical aesthetics are usually conducted versus where art is usually experienced. So in the lab versus the museum. And in the lab, you, of course, have more control, where it's difficult to control for factors that could influence the art experience, like other people in the museum. And this gap has been started to become recognized and in empirical aesthetics, and even and more studies are conducted in these so-called ecologically valid settings, that is, settings which are the real museum or gallery, or at least resemble that. And one aspect regarding the way the body is engaged in art experience in an ecologically valid setting is movement that I would like to expand on a bit more. But first, why is it interesting to look at strong embodiment and movement? Why is that interesting for art experience? As I mentioned, there's a shift in empirical aesthetics to move studies from the lab into more ecologically valid settings, because a lot of studies showed that context plays a role in the experience of art. And one aspect of the ecologically valid context is embodied engagement, and, for example, terms of movement. And this is under-considered in empirical aesthetics research, possibly due to a lack of methods on how to even assess movement. And actually, embodied cognition claims that the experience is based on having a body and the way we move our body in the environment. Based on this, we have the hypothesis that art experience might be related to how we move during it. So we did a study on how do we move in front of a single artwork and how does this relate to art experience, looking at strong embodiment. This has never been done before, so we developed a new paradigm. So in this experiment, we placed one abstract artwork in this gallery room. The artwork that was chosen for the study was a high-quality reproduction of an abstract oil painting titled Kämpfende Formen. We chose it because it had this balanced composition and was generally uniform in terms of, for example, visual complexity. And then we tracked participants' movements with 2 movement trackers that we placed in the corners of the room. They worked with infrared cameras, and they were in this wooden box in the corners of the room. We did not tell the participants that the movement was tracked. So participants were not aware that the movement was tracked. And I think some of them thought that the boxes and the corners were speakers or something. And this is the floor plan of this ecologically valid gallery setting, what it looked like. So participants entered the hallway where the artwork was hung here on the top. And then this was this gallery space. And yeah, in addition, we combined this with mobile eye tracking. So participants wore mobile eye tracking glasses. So mobile eye tracking allows us to examine the viewing patterns from the point of view of an individual in action. No, we can't find my mouse. So using this method, we could record where participants looked at on the artwork while they were moving. For example, here. And you can already see in this figure where they looked at. So we used a heat map overlaid on the artwork as a method to show where participants looked at the artwork. Mean viewing time was approximately 3 minutes. And the numbers in the grid represent the relative amount of fixations that landed in each grid cell. And as you can see, most of the fixations, so a total of 25%, landed in the center 3 cells, and only 3.4% of the fixations were outside the artwork. And we also found relatively more fixation at the top 2 rows than the bottom rows. And we also found a general or typical pattern of how participants moved. So here you can see the floor plan with the artwork at the top, and the blue dotted lines represent the mean of the X standing position. Here, X standing and Y standing position. They kept a visual angle of almost 90 degrees, and you can say that they stayed in the center, and then they don't get super close. They kept a distance of 0.5 meter. And here we plotted each participant's trajectory and overlaid them. We had 39 participants, and you can see this T-shape. So participants moved along the Y-axis, and then from the left to the right when they were closer to the artwork. And here you can see all trajectories individually, so not overlaid. So again, the floor plan from above. So this is where the artwork was. For example, this participant started on the right side at the back, and then went to the left, and then in front of the artwork went to the right, and then back again to the left corner. Or this one went to the front, then back again, and then to the front again, and then back again. Again, all 39 trajectories overlaid on top of each other. And then we wanted to see whether we can find shared patterns between participants. So I classified each participant's trajectory into groups using a set of metrics. For example, the straightness of the trajectory, the step length, the mean standing positions on the Y or X axis, the trajectory length, and the duration it took to complete the trajectory. And here you can see the 4 resulting clusters, and the trajectories that fell into each group are overlaid. And next, we related these patterns to the art experience. I didn't mention that before, but after each participant spent as much time as they wanted in the room, we gave them a questionnaire to ask them about the experience. For the art experience, we, for example, asked how aware they were about the approach to the artwork, whether they thought the art was dynamic, whether they felt stimulated, emotionally aroused, positive emotion, or insight. And just to give you an example of how to connect the body to the experience, I would like to look at insight. So participants in cluster 2 in green, they didn't move so much and they stayed at the distance from the artwork, and they reported a lesser insightful experience because this green bar is lower than the others, than participants in, for example, cluster 4, which really moved a lot. And I know that they also spent the longest time in the room. And as an additional measure beyond the actual movement, so the objective movement tracking, it's also important to consider the subjective experience of one's body during art engagement, because at least based on theoretical discussions, it can be argued that subjective aspects such as the awareness of the immediacy and physical presence of the art, oneself and the environment, are aspects of experiencing art. So we asked whether they felt that the room influenced the encounter, whether they were aware of their movement, of their approach, or the standing distance. And you can see in this figure that participants are generally aware of the room and their movement, the approach to the artwork, and the viewing distance, because the means are above the midpoint, which was 4. And just some more appraisals that we collected. And you can see that feeling stimulated, positive emotion, and body awareness had the highest ratings. So interestingly, participants are aware of their body while viewing art in the gallery. So this study was the first very exploratory attempt to see how we move relates to art experience. And also this study is with visual art, which is also the primary art form used in empirical aesthetics research. But an art form that has been under-considered in empirical aesthetics is installation art, maybe because it engages the bodily and proprioceptive experiences in a more specific way, which I'll get into in the following slides. Yeah, and by this we're getting closer to the workshop topic and my study on Thomas Saraceno's work. Yeah, in the following, I want to make clear why this art form is so special and interesting to me and relevant for today. So in the art historical literature, installation art has been widely noted to evoke and require use of the body in terms of participation. So the dependence of installation art on the spectators has been reflected since the early 60s under the notion of the inclusion of the viewer. So the participatory audience expects to play a significant part in the completion of the work and its reception. So the participant is part of the experience, and so is the experience part of the artwork. And in this way, installation art is often relational, where emphasis is placed on the role of the visitor in the realization and the reception of the artwork. Where's my mouse? Here. And the next characteristic is on the way the body is engaged in installation art. So especially compared to paintings, which can be grasped more instantaneously, the often larger scale of installation artworks require physical activity, active exploration, spatial movement, and also time is required to be able to fully explore a larger work of art rather than a smaller piece. And third, installation art is often intended to activate the body, so to increase awareness of one's body and bodily presence and cause bodily experiences. And here I have a few examples of more installation art pieces that address the body in various ways. And we have seen some of the following examples in this workshop before. So this bouncy castle was presented as a trigger for the vestibular system. Yeah, and also in this piece, it becomes clear that the visitor becomes a participant and arouses their body by jumping on this bouncy castle. Another example, although it is a painting, it is distributed across the room and you can actually walk on the painting. Here you can see one of James Turrell's light and space installations where visitors reported bodily experiences like weightlessness or floating, because there was no clear distinction between the floor and the ceiling and the depth anymore. Or this tape structure where you can crawl through, and at the same time, when you're below, you can watch the other visitors move above you. Here you can see an installation by Anne Hamilton, and this fabric here actually moved up and down, and at some point, visitors started to lay down below and watched the fabric move above them. And this interaction wasn't actually intended by the artist, but I can imagine that it looked very beautiful to watch the fabric moving above you. And probably once one person started, others just joined. And this installation was intended to lift up a single visitor at the time to play with the sense of gravity. And now I finally come to the installation artwork for my study. Some of you have experienced it. I will focus on it a bit more, and I chose this artwork because it addresses all these characteristics that I mentioned before, like participation, movement, and bodily experience. To those who weren't there, there's a video. So it's this 3-layer set that you can enter. You could all see the video. Just a bit of background. This installation is inspired by spider nets and also part of Thomas Saraceno's cloud structures, in which he addresses the concept of utopia and living in the clouds. And so I said I chose this installation because it very nicely picks up some of the characteristics I mentioned before. So, for example, participation, which was also intended by the artist, who said that the audience is important, they make the piece, and also if there's no person in the work, there is no work, it is invisible. Without the people in the work, there's nothing to see almost. So spectators become performers vital to the successful execution of the work. And another interesting aspect that a lot of the experiences I found in the internet, in interviews and articles, but also from my own experience, are related to the body. I collected these testimonies before I started collecting data for my study. So I want to have a look at the phenomenology of this installation with focus on the bodily experiences. Many reported feeling their body balance or weightlessness, their core stability, their heart pounding, their breathing. Someone said that they felt the net under their fingers while crawling. Someone experienced the themes of falling, floating, and flight. Someone said, as I left the net hanging in the sky, I felt overwhelmed by my own weight on the concrete ground. Someone read this work as a performance event, focusing on the role of the spectator's body. And so anecdotally, and also from your my own experience, this installation artwork especially does something to the body. However, in Neurostatics and Empirical aesthetics, this has never been empirically assessed. So this leads me to the first research question for my study. So what kind of experiences do people have on the bodily level, and can we empirically capture that? How I started to assess this was with the qualitative part, where participants were invited to reflect on the experience of their body during the experience, and then to describe briefly in their own words what this was like or any notable aspects. And then I employed 29 items that looked at aspects to the body. For example, an awareness of the body, and participants here could rate how much they made this experience on a Likert scale, ranging from 1 to 7, so 1 not at all and 7 extremely. Or also items looked at the heartbeat, balance, gravity, movement of other visitors, a sense of being watched, and more. And yeah, in addition to the body, psychologically, this artwork is very interesting because it has been noted to evoke intense emotions. So the artist said that many reported emotions to him like trust, hesitation, joy, fear, happiness, uncertainty. Thank you, Juliane Zetschke, for sending me this text, but also fear and desire and emotions about life and death, thrill and fear. So altogether the experience can be thrilling, existential, that tests emotional and physical limits. And also the curator noted that rarely does a work of art involve the viewer so directly emotionally. Also, I found this one that I found interesting, where visitors sat down on the net for a moment and described, I realized that I have never had an aesthetic experience quite like this one before. And in order to capture the emotional experience in the survey, I used this Geneva emotion wheel consisting of 16 different emotions, and also some other emotions that were found in the interviews I presented before. And for example, wonder, which is argued to be a prototypical aesthetic emotion. And these were also listed with Likert scales, so participants could rate how much they experienced the emotions. And besides all these emotions, the artist wanted to make people more sensitive to the installation, other people, or even the weather, and said, who knows, maybe this sensitivity will lead to more peace. And he was interested in how this installation generates new ideas. And so the installation gives the opportunity to perceive the world from new heights and vantage points. So this change in the environment triggers thought processes, self-perception, perspective change. So there's a lot of, or some reflection or even change or transformation happening. And that the installation art allows the viewer to discover new things or new things about themselves. And here we also have the bridge to the artist project. And keeping in mind that this installation artwork maybe induces these self-reflective experiences that some people have already reported. On the internet, there's a good deal of literature that suggests that body awareness may play a role in self-reflective art experiences. And in psychological models of art experience, the body has been noted as a trigger to induce reflection on the self, so that awareness of one's body facilitates a switch to an inward reflected mode. So the body is seen as a modality for self-reflection. And I can also see that there's a connection to day 2 of this workshop, where Ksenia Fedorova also noted in her lecture that proprioception could be a method for thinking. And this leads me to the second research question I have, whether high awareness of the body relates to more self-reflective experiences. How we try to capture self-reflection or change based on these items that appeared in this psychological model of art experience by Matthew Pawlowski. So, for example, self-awareness, experiencing something novel, insightful, profound, transformation, anxiety, confusion, awe. And on to the next research question. So to recap, it's interesting to me that the experience of installation art is not mainly based on the object and its visual attributes, but also on the experience of one's own body, proprioception, and kinesthetics. And this is also grounded in the philosophical theory, a bit of philosophy here, of pragmatist aesthetics, which recognizes the body as the experiential core of action and perception. And on top of that, according to the Embodied Aesthetics thesis by Barbara Montero, one can have an aesthetic experience of one's own body as perceived through the senses other than vision and audition. So in other words, proprioception is an aesthetic sense. One can make aesthetic judgments based on proprioceptive experience. So the idea here is that proprioception may play an aesthetically relevant role in the experience of the receiver of art. This has also been found in some aesthetics, which foregrounds the role of bodily experience in aesthetic appreciation. So I wonder whether participants enjoy the bodily experience they're having and how much the bodily experience relates to other factors of the art experience, such as emotion. These ideas are further evaluated, not with installation art, but here on the experience of architecture. where Schusterman wrote, if the appreciation of architecture is so strongly linked to somatic experiences, such as proprioception, then heightening somatic consciousness could improve our architectural experience. Interestingly, I found a similar theoretical idea for watching and performing dance. So Montero wrote, it is likely that much of the proprioceptive information we receive about the movements of others and even ourselves is below the level of conscious awareness. But by shifting our awareness to the proprioceptive experience of watching other moves and moving ourselves, this could change. If I am right, certain aspects of the observer's experience of dance can be enhanced by an awareness of the bodily feeling of dance. So I'd love to test these theories empirically. So my last research question is whether individuals who are generally more aware of their body or more or less attuned to their bodily sensations also report more bodily experiences. And then, so how do individual differences in body awareness relate to art experience? A short note on body awareness. So I'm interested in the role of body awareness in the experience of installation art. And with this, I do not only include proprioception, but also interoception. So for example, your heart beating, or exteroception, so which is sensing the space around you, and kinesthetics, which is related to movement. And in this study, I start with the self-report measure, the Maya 2, on interoception, and such questionnaire batteries are used in psychology to assess or control for individual differences. And short disclaimer, there is no widely accepted standard measurement for general proprioceptive accuracy, also because most of the proprioception is below the level of consciousness or conscious awareness. And also because all the tests that exist, they're super specific to individual body parts. So skin conductance is usually measured on the hands, or the joint position sense is on how well you can point with your knee or arm on a specific point. And there are even very task-specific differences within each aspect. So one cannot assess general proprioceptive accuracy from a single test that, for example, only looks at the hand but leaves out the whole rest of the body. Yeah, but we have this interoception survey, and with this I want to find out how generally aware participants are of their body. And by using this analysis, we can test whether general ability in body awareness, so the trait, influences the reported body awareness during the experience of the installation art, which then influences art experience. To sum up, research questions again, I showed you that installation art is designed for the body, and it's only complete when the body enters the installation, and it's supposed to evoke bodily experiences. But this has never been empirically tested. And in addition to that, it has been proposed in psychological models of art experience that the body is a trigger for self-reflection. And also anecdotally, people have these self-reflective, profound experiences in this installation. So I want to see whether there's a different relationship between the bodily experience and the self-reflective experiences. And the question is whether people enjoy these kinds of bodily experiences. And lastly, do participants who generally have higher body awareness, whether they also report more and more intense experiences related to the body, and how does this relate to art experience? This is just what the survey looked like. Informed consent instructions at the beginning. I started with this open question on the bodily experience, then the bodily experience items, and then the art experience items, so the emotion and the cognitive self-reflection. And then we had this survey on individual differences in interoception, then some art appraisals, so whether the participants liked the art, whether they found it beautiful, whether they understood the art, and then demographics on age, gender. I also asked them whether they are afraid of heights because it's high, their art preference, so whether they generally like installation art or contemporary art, whether they've been on this installation before, and if yes, how many times, and whether they experienced the installation alone or with other people. And at the end, there was an open text box in case someone wanted to say something. So just some summary, impact, future outlook. So I hope that this project will start a seed for the empirical investigation of the experience of installation art, and that I hope that I made clear that any fruitful investigation of art experience, of installation art in empirical aesthetics research should include the experience of proprioception and the body. And this research can be embedded into 4E cognition, according to which cognition is embodied, extended, embedded, and inactive. So experience is based on the bodily features, motor skills, situatedness, and active engagement in the physical environment. So embodiment depends on our activity in the environment. Also, Svetlana Chernyshova mentioned this yesterday. So we're not a brain attached to a computer, but we are a brain in the body, in the environment, making experiences in the environment and doing actions in the environment. So it's vital to consider these elements when empirically studying psychology. And art is just one special example of human psychological experience. And besides having a body and being able to move in order to explore art that I mentioned, like exploring, moving around with it, we also need the body to experience the feelings and emotions that play an important role in aesthetic experience. And I did not speak about this in aspect of the body in this experience, but there's a lot of interesting research, for example, this one that looked at body maps of emotional experiences while viewing art, so where emotions were experienced in the body. Yeah, and I hope that I can do this study design or a similar one with further installation artworks in the future to collect more data. I put together some books if you're interested in installation art or neurostatics. Also the references that I mentioned. I would like to especially thank my supervisors in Vienna and Berlin in my lab and collaborators. Yeah, so that was my presentation. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Corinna, for this rich talk. Thank you very much. So now we have a look.
So thanks for a really interesting talk. As someone who's been working on installation art for a few years now, I found it really, really interesting. So perhaps this is a naive question by someone who doesn't do empirically informed research, because I am a philosopher and an aesthetician. But I was wondering whether you or the team you are part of has considered doing research on the involvement of the imagination in the experience of installation art, and especially on the link between the fact that we undergo certain bodily experiences, proprioceptive experiences, while inside certain works of installation art, and the fact that we might be prompted to engage in specific imaginings by the very having of those experiences. So, for instance, when you described Saraceno's work, I think in his own words, he says something like, "Oh well, this work is about, among other things, living in the clouds." Well, that is a metaphor, right? And in order to grasp that metaphor, we have to employ our imaginative abilities. And it seems that there might be an interesting link there to explore between how it feels for us to be inside that environment and how this prompts us to explore certain imaginings. So this is an idea that I think is relevant for the understanding of installation art, and I'm exploring it with completely different, purely philosophical means. And I was wondering whether you've thought about this and whether it can easily be included in an empirical study.
Yeah, thank you for this question. This is definitely super relevant, and I've thought about it. And the way I thought about that experimentally was to have one group of visitors enter an installation and have another group of participants view the installation that is recorded in a video or just photos of it. Because also during the COVID crisis, a lot of exhibitions were put online in like virtual exhibitions. So it could be a nice experimental design to compare the experience of the participants who are actually in the installation art and the participants who just view the installation in a like virtual exhibition and like imagine what it's like to be in the installation and experience it bodily, and then see whether they also report any bodily sensations. Yeah, but this has never been conducted before. So if there's a possibility that like an exhibition or installation art has been video recorded, I would totally like to take that opportunity.
Okay, great. I think Marcus is in the queue.
Thanks a lot for this very informative talk, both on two aspects, content-wise, but also the way you work. Because for me, as an armchair philosopher, armchair scientist, it's great to see these insights also into empirical work. Now, my question was, when the subgroup of us who visited Saraceno's net, we also filled in the survey, your survey, and some of us were wondering why you asked, for example, the parameter of guilt, whether someone felt guilt while being in the net. Now, your talk clarified it somehow, because you refer to this Geneva emotion wheel, and I guess this is some kind of standard in empirical research on emotions, and this is, I guess, why you used it. My question is, why do you leave in emotions that, at least prima facie, are irrelevant to the artwork? Because most of us thought, why is she asking about whether we felt guilty when being in the net? Isn't that irrelevant? Now, why would you? There might be a reason why you leave that in. That's my question.
First of all, thank you for taking part in the survey, and also I have to give credits to my colleague Hannah Kruft, who's currently standing in the museum. So you already hinted at that asking for emotions is like a standard thing, and this is the case. Yeah, I think if I would have only included emotions that I expected, this would have been a bit biased by me as a researcher. And in general, part of the artist project, we try to like find out like the range of emotions that are generally experienced in installation art, in art experiences in general. And we have this list of 80 emotions, and it just wasn't possible to include these 80 in this study, because if that's like people spend like half an hour, 1.5 hours in the museum, they don't want to sit there for half an hour filling out a survey. So I had to cut them off, and then decided on this emotion wheel, and then some individual extra emotions. Just to get a broad overview. And I think guilt can be an emotion that can be experienced can pop up in the experience of art. Yeah.
Okay, great. So
of
Robin,
course, thanks. I see. Thank you.
Thank you.
Robin Curtis would be next.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much for your talk. It was really super interesting. I have a question about the portion where you're dealing with corporeal response to form, rather than, say, specific representations that are identifiable as representations of objects. And one of the things that I'm interested in is the way in which form, when viewed in the light of mirror neuron research, is always linked, because of the question of intentions, to the intentions of a creator. In other words, the macaque grasps a peanut. And what's ascribed to the macaque in mirror neuron research is a particular intention, or that's understood to be the thing that's like a goal orientation. So it would seem to be logical then that the research on painting that you described also focuses on the intention of the creator. In other words, the making of a slit or the creation of a line. In other words, by a human agent. And because I work on audiovisual media, in other words, works that are created through the medium of a camera and are less connected to a creator, in other words, are not directly related to human activity necessarily. I'm very curious about the way in which perhaps it's possible to account for formal engagement through like a kind of corporeal engagement with form that is not ascribed to a human agent. In other words, do we reinscribe? My question for you is, do we as viewers then reinscribe agency in a non-human medium? Or is it possible to test for ways in which we can see abstraction and abstract form as being corporeally experienced, but not filtered through an agent? In other words, not as the representation of an action performed by somebody who's gone before me, who had particular goals. Do you understand what I'm getting at? Like, how can we actually account for what we see in the context of a non-human medium?
Yeah, thank you for your interesting question. So I think the way this embodied simulation of abstract art is understood, or at least how I understood it, it's not so much about the form, but rather about the goal-directed movement. I go back to the slide, so that you can infer the action, the intended action of the artist in these abstract drawings. Yeah, and then the question would be whether we could also do that when we would know that this isn't by an artist, but say, for example, from a computer-generated some AI. Because I know that we're really, like humans are super good at putting intention into everything we see. So, for example, if you see some scratches on a tree, then we think it was some beer or some human. And not that it was nature, but that it was someone. So I guess we're quite good at this. Yeah, but I think this hasn't been looked at. We did studies on like emotional recognition from human-made versus AI-generated art. That's something we looked at, but not with regards to this embodiment, but rather just can people recognize emotions from art that was made from humans versus the computer. Does this somehow answer your questions or give some further thinking to it?
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Ludger Schwarte will be next.
Yeah, also thanks from my side for this talk. I've been following empirical aesthetics for quite some time. I remember 2007, I think I was with Helmut Leder in the sketches of a project of how we perceive pictures. And as you yourself described the development of this field, it started with Fmri scans, where people were very much isolated and watched reproductions of pictures. And then one saw which area of the brain was activated. And already at the time, my question was, so what actually do you find out when you find out that an area of the brain is activated? That some neurons in some area fire. Okay, you find out a correlation. This happens if in that situation. The underlying assumption or the ideology of that kind of research, of course, was that it was because the brain fires in that situation that we see it that way. But I think on the long run, this paradigm of brain-centeredness has been lost or has been neglected. You show now a methodology that is different. You also showed this this, as you called it, ecologically more valid setting, where there was, as you said, a highly qualitatively good reproduction of the artwork, but still it wasn't the original. And you were measuring movements. And if I understood it correctly, you were measuring movements of individuals in front of this painting. And you could show that there's a correlation of the bodily movement to the intensity of the perception of the painting, right? So there was, again, a correlation between a certain kind of movement, a bodily movement, and a certain kind of, say, appreciation, involvement, and introspection also. And that's, of course, interesting. But now you work with, if I understand it correctly, you work with a questionnaire. And that makes me think of another sort of empirical approach to art, which is sociological. So in sociology, you might ask the same questions that you addressed to Thomas Saraceno, and you would do it for different purposes. You would find out how in society we deal with such artworks, and how certain persons, which maybe have also certain social qualifications, react to certain artworks. But you do seem to have a different approach. And so I have a twofold question. The one is, what do you find out, actually, if you have all these questionnaires? Or what do you want to find out, other than a correlation between certain emotions and certain settings that are, in your terms, ecologically valid? And the second, maybe more interesting question, is a follow-up to Elisa Calderola's question, something that I'm working out on now, which is what one way of describing these works, these artworks, in difference to, say, when we collectively watch the TV news in the evening, seeing the horrors in the world, is that we don't really know what we have in front of our eyes. So we have to deploy some kind of imagination, but we do so, let's say, collectively. And I wonder whether it could be of interest for you, or what you would say, once you leave behind a bit this methodological, how do you say, a priori, or of the single individuum that you focus on, and rather focus on the social situation in which, say, installation art is seen. So if you would agree that there's something in installation art that presents us collectively with something that we have difficulties of assessing, of knowing how to move around it, then not only the object that we perceive or the situation we're in plays a role, but also how other people are reacting to it. And that might also inform our proprioception. So do you understand there's a twofold question? The one is what you want to find out, and the other is, in addition to Elisa Calderola, how would you think about, say, the interaction of bodies being relevant to art experience?
Yeah, thanks for this complex question. Just to quickly comment on the neuro stuff first, I agree that Neurostatics has been criticized as being quite reductionistic, like reducing the experience to this experience in the scanner. And I think that Neurostatics can help to say a lot about the workings of the brain, but cannot say so much about art. So I think art is an interesting stimuli to find out things about the brain, especially visual experiences. Yeah. And then the first of the two questions were what my aim was with this movement study, I think. So first of all, it's really a proof of concept. This has never been done before, and we were like the first lab to set up this design and looked at if we can even objectively track movement, if we can find these patterns. And then everything in analysis that we did was really super correlational. And this, of course, doesn't say much yet, but this was a first attempt to, for example, find out if like more engagement leads to like higher, like more intense art experiences, whether like people have to engage with the artwork to come up with the experiences, or whether it's rather beneficial to like stand and not move at all, because then I think there's the stopping for knowledge hypothesis, that it's good that when you like that you have to stop and not move in order for all your resources in your brain to be able to perceive beauty, because otherwise your body would be engaged in moving. So there's not so many cognitive capacities left to like form a beauty judgment. So the question is whether maybe when people move more or less, there are different art experiences that can pop up. And then on top of that, the second question was the social aspect, I think. And for this experiment, we only let in one participant at the time, so we completely excluded this social aspect. And of course, in the future, that would be super interesting to look at, but this would also involve more quality, like control of everything. And I know that in sociology, there are observational studies where they looked at how participants, like museum visitors, interact to, for example, gain more meaning or like try to understand an exhibition together with like photographs or like video observations. And yeah, this can be done descriptively, but I wonder how to do that in a quantitative way. And also there's research by my supervisor, Matthew Ryplowski, who at least found out for visual art in museums that it's not beneficial for the art experience to be with other people. There's one paper on it. You can find it on the internet at least. Yeah. Did I?
Thank you. Thank you. I think we do have time for last question as we are closing the workshop. So probably we can afford having another question by Julian Kettermann.
Yeah, thanks. It's also just a small question. You made at the beginning the distinction between weak and strong embodiment. And I was wondering what exactly you meant with that. So you made like cases for what is doing and what a weak and a strong embodiment was, and with the weak one being the mirror neuron system having the simulation of someone else's movements, and then the strong embodiment being an actual action carried out. And I was wondering about the notion of first the actual action, and I was wondering how you could, or if you could, transfer this to the mixed reality spectrum. Because if we even just think of augmented reality, if I, for example, play like pool, like billiard, in augmented reality, and I push a simulated ball against another one, would that be an actual action? Because we would get the illusion that we, for example, did an action like pushing one ball against the other, but we wouldn't get all the feedback that we would in the normal world. So I was just wondering about the notion of the actual actions and how mixed reality fits in the embodiment.
Super interesting question. Just a disclaimer, this is not my theory on weak and strong embodiment. It's by Gallagher 2018 in this paper, Building a Stronger Concept of Embodiment. And I think you understood it correctly, that the weak embodiment is the like representation of actions and movements in the brain, but the strong embodiment is the actual execution of these. And I haven't thought about the VR one yet. I think this could somehow involve both forms. And now I want to go back and look at this paper and see if Gallagher mentioned VR experiences. So I cannot answer at this point, but it's definitely interesting. Question.